I wanted to share with you today a very interesting and relatively unknown episode in American history, and that is the U.S. Army's Camel Corps. Any of you heard of it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, good. Your teachers did a good job. I taught history for many years, and one year, about a week before school started, my supervisor came in and he said, Nancy, we've gone on this new quarter system now, and we've got all these new courses, and we've decided you're going to teach one called The History of the American West. And I said, well, that sounded kind of interesting. I said, fine, just give me the textbook. Oh, well, it's just a general textbook, And, well, fine, just give me the course guides. Well, it hadn't been written yet. And, what are the guidelines? Well, you just have to play it by ear. So I had to cover a period from 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase to the end of the frontier in 1890, from the Mississippi westward to California. 12 weeks holding high school students' attention. And I had to stay one step ahead of them every night. I was trying to dig up information, spending nights and weekends at the library. And so I came across the story of the U.S. Camel Corps, and I thought that will get the kids' attention. And it did. And so I found a lot of little interesting things that I could share with the kids, because quite frankly, a lot of the things in the American West, while interesting, you can share with adults, but you can't necessarily share with high school students. So anyway, we're going to talk today about the Army's Camel Corps. The first interest in the Camel Corps began way back in 1836. Now, that's the same year that Texas was involved in our revolution to win independence. A man, a major in the U.S. Army by the name of George Crossman, had served in the Seminole Wars, and he had seen the difficulty in transportation and communication, getting men, supplies, orders, and so forth across rough terrain using mules, horses, or oxen. And the animals couldn't always carry the loads that were needed. They had to be continually supplied with food and water. They had to be reshod. Their wagons couldn't go over mountains, or it was difficult to ford rivers. There were just innumerable problems. And he could foresee, now there's just this new country down here called Texas, and the idea was hopefully one day we'll get Texas to join us, and we need some communication and a better means of getting supplies to that area. And so he began to look around to see if there was an alternate to these other animals that they'd been using. And he did some reading, and he came across what was called the ship of the desert, the camel, that had been used in the Middle East and Africa for thousands of years. But he didn't have the time really to go into a great study of this, and so he assigned a subordinate, a man by the name of Major Henry Wayne, to do the digging. And Wayne got involved, and he dug and he dug and he researched, and he came up with the information he needed. He learned, first of all, that there are two types of camels. There's the Arabian, or the dromedary, which has one hump. It's usually taller, faster, used more for express purposes. The other is the Bactrian, or the two hump, which is shorter, stockier, slower, but can carry heavier loads. But other than the one or two humps, they essentially share all the same features. The first one is camels can go for inordinate periods of time without food and water. And when they do find food, they eat almost anything. They're kind of like goats. They'll eat pebbles, roots, berries, cactus, things with thorns, sagebrush that would kill a horse, a mule, or an ox. A camel can go for 10 days without food and water, still going 30 miles a day, carrying heavy loads. Now, the camel stores its food and water, its excess food and water, in its hump. And as long as it's getting nourishment, finding nourishment, that hump remains firm. But when it has to go without food and water, it begins to drain the nourishment from that hump. And so, as it does, the hump becomes limp, and it just hangs down on the side, giving the camel a rather ugly appearance. Of course, it's ugly enough to begin with. most animals just shed their fur, loosely. Camels shed it in those big old clumps that hangs around on them, makes them look moth-eaten. So the camel can eat almost anything, and he can go for long periods of time without food and water. The camel's feet are divided. They're split. I don't know if you can see that here, but they're split. Unlike the horny hooves of the mules, horses, or oxen. And they're covered with this thick padding of leather. The same is true. They've got leather here on their chest and on their knees. On the knees and chest, it's necessary for protection from the hot sands when they kneel. They're so tall. They're 6 feet at the shoulder and about 7 to 8 feet at the hump. And so in order to be loaded, they have to kneel. And so the padding here on the knees and the chest protects them. The padding on their feet enables them to walk over almost anything: volcanic rock, rough ground, hard-packed dirt, bushes, undergrowth. When pressure is applied, the padding here expands. So on shifting sands, they don't wobble, they don't lose their footing. Now they're rather ungainly. This is because they don't walk like other animals. When a camel walks, it lifts both feet on the same side at the same time, which gives it that rocking motion, and which, if you're riding, makes you nauseous or seasick. Any of you ever ridden a camel?
A little bit.
A little bit. Did you get seasick?
I didn't go that far.
Their disposition is not all that good. When they're loaded, or being loaded, they kneel down. And while they don't really mind being loaded, it's just sort of the principle with them, and so they complain. And if you were in an area where lots of camels were being loaded, unloaded, and loaded, it would be just deafening, horrendous amount of noise as they snorted and bellowed and complained. They just complained all the time. And they've really got a foul disposition. They kick, they bite, and they can spit. And I tell you, they can spit from experience. One got me right here. The camel's body temperature also differs from that of horses or mules or oxen. Those animals, like most others, have to maintain a body temperature of about 100 degrees. So you start out in the morning, you're 100 degrees. As you go over hot, blistering sands, the temperature outside goes up, so does your temperature, and as that temperature increases, you begin to sweat and the body fluids are lost. The animal then has to pull water from the tissues, other tissues, and this causes the blood to thicken. The animals become less efficient, more lethargic. The camel doesn't have that problem. The camel's temperature varies. It's very low in the morning, and so whereas other animals start out at 100 degrees, the camel's well below that. So it takes him a longer time to reach that higher temperature, and the camel doesn't even begin to sweat until he's at least 105 degrees. And so he has a distinct advantage over the other animals that we've mentioned. Plus, the animals and camels, and I don't know if you can see it here, but I'll be happy to pass it around later, has a slit in each nostril. And that slit can be opened to allow it to breathe. In dust storms, it closes to protect it. Other beasts of burden don't have that. Also, these slits on either side run down to a slit in the upper lip. And you can see it right there. And so as the moisture is released, it's funneled into those slits and back into the mouth. He has his own recycling program. Doesn't have to worry. The camel is long-lived. Average age, length of life is about 50 years. At about 3, he can start to carry heavy loads and can carry those loads like 1,500 pounds up until the time he's in his mid-40s. The camel also has an advantage over those other pack animals in that they have to stop in a blinding sandstorm. They can't see. They have to close their eyes. The camel has real long, beautiful, long lashes that protect its eyes, plus its eyelids are transparent. So sand just hits it and bounces off, and the camel just goes right on. Well, these were all the things, these things I've shared with you, are what Major Henry Wayne learned about camels, and he became a great advocate. He could see that, if we ever get Texas, we could use camels down there to help us. And so he began to espouse his beliefs, and others picked up on them. Among those who picked up on the idea was a senator from Mississippi. He was a member of the Senate Military Affairs Committee. His name was Jefferson Davis. And Davis began to think, that's a possibility. Well, in 1846, along came the Mexican War. Now, Texas, of course, had been independent from 1836 to 1845. 1845, Texas joined the Union. 1846, after Texas joined the Union, Mexico was angry. They declared war, and for the next 2 years, we were involved in the Mexican War. When that war was over in 1848, the United States had Texas and everything all the way to California, all the way to the Pacific. Now, what do you do with it? You have this tremendous amount of territory. There are no roads. Railroads, of course, are not even going to arrive till May of 1869. There are no roads, there are no forts. Now, Texas had roads, and Texas had forts. But once you left Texas, there were no roads, no forts. And so the government realized very quickly it's got to do something to protect all of those settlers that are now pouring into this area to populate it. Plus, in 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Fort in California, and thousands of people were heading west to hopefully get rich that way. So all these people heading west, either traveling through or planning to settle. But you had to have roads, you had to have forts, you had to have soldiers stationed out there, and if soldiers are stationed out there, you have to provide them with food and water. You have to have a transportation and communication system. So in 1851, Davis introduced a bill in Congress that would provide funds to purchase camels. It was turned down. It was defeated. He tried again, 52 and 53, both unsuccessfully. But in 1853, something happened which changed things. Anybody know what it was? 1853? Jefferson Davis became Secretary of War. He now was in a position to do something about his pet project. And so almost immediately he pushed a bill through Congress that provided $30,000 for the purchase of camels. This was in March of 1855. Almost immediately, Major Wayne was sent to the Middle East and Africa to begin the purchase of these animals. And over the course of the next few years, he would make several trips. So he went to the Middle East and Africa, and he purchased his animals, and in February of 1856, he left Smyrna. He had 34 animals. He had 33. He had 20 females, 12 males, and 1 calf. During the voyage, which took 3 months, 6 calves were born. 4 of them died. The first one to be born was named Uncle Sam. They arrived in late April off the coast of Indianola to unload the camels. But the seas were too rough, and so they instead sailed over to the western mouth of the Mississippi to a place called Belize, and they unloaded the camels onto steamers and transported them back to Indianola, well, to Powderhorn, 3 miles north of Indianola, Texas. And they arrived there in the middle of May of 1856. Well, people had heard about the imminent arrival of these camels, and so there were lots of spectators come to witness it. Now, the camels had done very well on the voyage. 6 calves born, 4 died, plus 1 of the adults died. And part of the reason that fewer didn't die was because the camels knelt most of the way, and they weren't subjected to injury by hitting the sides of the ship, due to the rolling motion of the ship. But as the poor camels walked off, you couldn't help but feel sorry for them. Spectators threw rotten vegetables at them. They laughed at them. They derided them. These foreign creatures coming in. They were ugly and ungainly, and what on earth could they accomplish? Well, it made Wayne mad, and so he immediately had one kneel down He loaded it with 1,500 pounds of hay. The camel just nonchalantly got up and wandered off, which amazed the people. And then he hitched one each to wagons. So he had two wagons, each pulled by one camel, to prove that they could, pull wagons as well. Now it was Wayne's hope that he would be able to spend some time acclimating the animals. All of them had been on board ship 3 months. Those that he had purchased the earliest, had been on board ship 9 months. So it was going to take them time for them to get their land legs and to become acclimated. And so they stayed in the area around Indianola for a couple of weeks, and then it was decided that they were ready to be marched northward. So they marched them to San Antonio, let them rest there, fattening them up, feeding them, taking care of them. Wayne had the foresight to bring with him 5 native camel drivers. These camels understood commands only when given in Arabic or in Turkish, which Americans didn't speak. So he brought these 5 camel herders, or camel drivers. Also, they were to teach the men how to load camels. There's an art to it. If you don't load them correctly, the loads slip, they fall off, time is wasted, plus the animal gets a real sore back. So Wayne then began the 140-mile journey northward to their new home, their permanent home, which was Camp Verde. It was on the Verde River, just very close to Bandera Pass. And at Wayne's instructions, a unit had been created up. It's called a caravanserai. And the pens had been built just like the ones in the Middle East. They're called khans, and they were 9 feet, 10.5 inches tall to keep the animals in. So Wayne and Davis had a plan. We're going to spend 5 years, and we're going to, in that 5 years, train these animals. They soon learned it was going to be easier to train American soldiers to give Arabic commands than it was to teach the camels to respond in English. So they had to train soldiers. And this was difficult because soldiers didn't want any part of the camels. And they said the profanity around these training sites was just horrific. That I know in one letter, Jefferson Davis said to the president, he said, well, at least the profanity is less than it was last month. But the camels and the American soldiers just did not get along. These men were used to horses and mules, and they resented the camel, and they just didn't want any part of it. But the idea was, let's spend 5 years, let's build up the camp, let's build up the herd, let's develop a breeding program, let's do some trials to see, exactly what they can and cannot do. And so they presented this to Congress, and Congress said, no, you need to start immediately. Now, the animals had arrived at Camp Verde on August the 26th and 27th, 1856. The trials began September the 1st. I hope you can see the camels all along have not been given a fighting chance. The first trial was against mules. So you had 6 camels over here, and over here you had 3 wagons. Each wagon was pulled by 6 mules. They were to make a round trip. The trip from Camp Verde to San Antonio was 140 miles. Supposed to make a round trip carrying heavy loads. Now, the mules pulling the wagons were to go over roads that were already established. They would not have to cross any mountains. They would have food and water and rest stops provided. Camels were to have no food and water, no rest stops, and they were not to go over any known trail. They had to ford rivers, they had to climb mountains. The camels made the trip in 54 hours. They carried a total of 3,658 pounds. They had no problems. Their feet weren't hurt, no camels were lost. So when you do the math, you figure out that 6 camels can carry the same amount of weight, of load, as 2 6-mule team, two wagons each with 6 mules. And they did it in 42.5 hours, less time, with no injuries. So this was a good start for the camels. But the government said, no, we want to try another trial. So the next trial came the following month. This time it was against horses drawing wagons. 6 camels, 6 horse-drawn wagons. It was the same route, except this time it was to be, they waited for a day that there was a blinding rainstorm. Camels again made the trip in 54 hours. Horses never left Camp Verde because the wagons were stuck in the mud. So Wayne and Jefferson Davis were delighted. There were other trials that would take place in the Big Bend throughout the fall of 1856. In early 1857, Wayne was sent back to the Middle East. He hadn't spent all his money. On the first trip, he bought camels for $300 a piece, and he had $30,000. So he went back to buy more camels. This time he would bring back 44. He had both dromedaries and Bactrians, but the Bactrians died on the way, as well as a crossbreed. So the trials continued. The next big trial was to be the most dangerous, the most important, and this was to be from their base camp. They were to go from Camp Verde to San Antonio, because San Antonio is really the hub of things. And from San Antonio, they would go across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, all the way to California. And they were to scout the area, decide where the roads would be placed, where the forts would be built, where the way stations would be. They were to do reconnaissance against the Indians. You know, you name it, whatever military troops would do, this group had to do. This group included the camels, but this time there were 80 of them, camels and horses, mules. They made the trip from San Antonio to Fort Stockton in 36 hours. The mules and horses arrived half dead, even though they'd had food and water. The camels carried the food and water for the men and the horses and the mules. And a lot of them were lame. Camels were indifferent when offered water. They ate a little bit of greasewood and sagebrush, but were uninterested. The next step was from Fort Stockton to El Paso. They stopped there and rested. Then the next step from El Paso to Fort Defiance. Harper's Weekly and Harper's Bazaar were keeping abreast of what was going on, and they reported that the whole Camel Corps experiment was a success. And both Wayne and Jefferson Davis felt the same way. And so in 1858, 1859, and 1860, there would be other requests for additional funds. These would all be turned down by the government because by that time there were more important things on the horizon, that being sectional rivalry between the North and the South. And then the first blow came to the Camel Corps. Jefferson Davis was replaced as Secretary of War, and Major Wayne was recalled to Washington. So the Camel Corps had lost its two greatest supporters at a time when the military didn't like the camels to begin with. And then the Civil War came along. But I want to read you what Jefferson Davis, these are his actual words, what he had to say about the Camel Corps in writing to the president. Camels thrive in this climate. Desert testing kills mules and would have got the men too, except for the camels. Camel-borne light artillery can go anywhere an Indian can. Think how this will abbreviate the Western campaign. Think of the troopers' lives this will save. The mule is obsolete in the West. The camel experiment on the plains of the South has been a success. One camel is capable of doing the work of 4 mules and doing it more quickly and cheaply. These experiments have demonstrated the adaptation of the camel to the climate and circumstances of our country and its value for military purposes. These trials have fully realized my expectations and have increased my confidence in the success of the experiment. Well, the camels went on from Fort Defiance, and they would spend the next 48 days between Fort Defiance and California doing reconnaissance against the Indian. And as Jefferson Davis said, the camel was invaluable here. It could go where horses couldn't, but Indians could. Plus, a trooper mounted on a camel could see farther, had a greater advantage that way. Plus, in the beginning, the Indians were scared to death of the camel. They saw these coming across the plains. I can imagine what they must have thought. They used the camel for reconnaissance. They plotted the sites for forts. They plotted the sites for roads. And the idea would be that the camel would be the means of transportation of food and supplies to these forts and the maintenance of the road and communication until such time as transcontinental railroads. And as I mentioned before, the first transcontinental railroad wasn't completed until May the 10th of 1869. But the Civil War came. And in early 1861, Camp Verde was captured by the Confederacy. The Confederacy had no interest whatsoever in the camels. They used a few of them during the war for postal service, but the majority of them were just neglected. During the war, the corrals were not maintained. The camels were able to escape. They wandered around, were just totally neglected. One Union troop found 3 of them wandering in Iowa. I guess the Union troop was kind of surprised to see that as well. When the war was over, the Camp Verde returned to Union control. At that time, there were 100 camels at Camp Verde. And the Army would use a few of them for postal service in Texas. But the majority, 66 of them, it auctioned off for $31 apiece. They had cost the first group $300 apiece, the second group $250. I can't help but feel sorry for the poor camels. Just at a time when they were really proving themselves, the Civil War came along. And after the Civil War, well, if the Civil War hadn't come along, the Camel Corps probably would have been incorporated into the cavalry, the mounted rifles, and the dragoons. But the war did come along. And you say, well, why did the Union resume it after the war? Because it was Jefferson Davis's baby. And anything connected with Jefferson Davis was suspicious. They wanted no part of it. Plus, Texas and most of the rest of the Southwest was horse country. Cattlemen, mule skinners, horse wranglers, none of these people liked the camel. They saw it as competition. And when camels are around horses, they spook the horses. And the horses will stampede. They will buck their riders off. They will, if they're attached, hitched to wagons, they will start to buck and the wagons will overturn. People can be killed, wagons and supplies destroyed. And so the camel was seen just as a menace, a threat to the sanctity of the horse kingdom in Texas, and he was seen as a foreigner. As late as 1881, Indians in the Big Bend area reported to the government they captured 11 camels roaming freely, and that there was a big herd of them. In 1883, a big red camel in Arizona trampled and killed an Apache woman. And by this time, the Apaches were no longer afraid of the camel, but the people across the border in Mexico, the Mexicans were afraid. And so the Apaches tied this dead woman's body to the camel's hump. And for the next 10 years, that animal roamed with this skeleton on its back, scaring the Mexicans to death. And this camel was called the Red Ghost. The last known sighting of a camel, anyone care to venture a date? 1941. There were still camels in 1941 in Arizona. The camels proved that they could do what they were brought to do. They survived, they adapted, they reproduced in the American West. They just weren't given a fair chance. And I always feel sorry when I think of them as just being abandoned. As an animal lover, that just goes against the grain. Sort of like when I heard about the Army after Vietnam leaving its military dogs, either shooting them or leaving them. They don't do that anymore. Congress has since passed laws that protect our animals in service. But the camels weren't protected, but yet they survived. There is still to this day a monument to these camels at Fort Stockton, and it says, "The U.S. Army Camel Corps, a practical success, but a political failure." Are there any questions I might answer? Yes, ma'am.
So, if the South captured the fort where the camels were stored and Davis was in charge, why didn't he promote this?
I imagine he had his hands full. I don't have I don't have any record. I have a lot of his letters, but I don't have any record of his talking about the Camel Corps after that time. I imagine it was just one of those things that it was all he could do just to keep the war going. You would have thought, but
He had this asset.
yeah, he could have. I suppose the camels would have been. Well, I don't know how successful they would have been in Virginia or Georgia. They're adaptable, so they might have, but he surely could have used them in the few battles in Texas, Shelby's Rangers and so forth. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
This probably goes beyond your presentation a bit, but it was just marveling at the adaptation of these animals to the particular environment. Do we know more about what their predecessors were with respect to the animals that existed before they did? Or it's
You mean
just
in the Middle
amazing
East?
How their bodies were just.
I don't know. They're found only in the Middle East and Africa. I'm assuming they began one place and then migrated. I don't know. Are they descendants of leftover dinosaurs? Who knows? They're interesting creatures. As I said, you don't really want to be around them. Oh, and they smell horribly. Yeah. They aside from having that bad temperature, they do, and they're just. You can't help but feel sorry for them the way they look, but they didn't get a fair deal. They surely didn't.
Well, since I booked you for this program, I've talked to several people that have said, "Oh, well, there's camels in certain parts of Texas." I think Ginger, you want to mention that?
George and I were driving through Texas, back through central Texas, and he was just driving along, and I was just looking out the window, and I said, "George, I saw camels." And he said, "You're seeing things." And that was at Coyote, Texas. And about maybe a month later, there was an article in the Dallas Morning News about the Camel Corps at Coyote,
Yeah.
Texas.
And I'm sure it's probably descendants of these. Of course, I'm thinking that, I remember reading some time ago that some of the circuses went out into this area, into Texas and the far west, and captured some of these animals to use them in their shows. And that when the circuses disbanded, some of these animals were also released. So, and I've never even thought to inquire as to, if the Army branded them like they did their horses, so that one would know. But, and who knows, there may still be some back there and, way up in the mountains where they've remained hidden all these years. I'd like to think so, that they could survive past 1941. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for your time. You